Welcome to this Unicorn Films video. Unicorn Films continues as a legacy to its founder, Aidan Doyle. If you enjoy our content, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps more than you know. Thank you.
This Unicorn film is released without restriction as part of our Doing Good initiative. If you enjoy the film, please consider a donation to our designated registered charity for this film, which can be found in the video description below. Thank you.
Dublin, a city with 1,000 years of history and rich in culture, invaded by the Vikings, conquered by the Normans. Once used by Viking traders, the River Liffey, which flows beneath 13 busy bridges, is flanked by a variety of interesting buildings that illustrate the town architecturally. Dublin, in one of the loveliest settings of any European city, lies at the heart of Dublin Bay. To the south, it's sheltered by Dalkey and Dunleary, and to the north by the rocky Howth Peninsula. Dublin's atmosphere is made up of many things. The great Georgian Squares, Mountjoy, Fitzwilliam and Merrion, College Green, where Trinity College is situated, and opposite the former Parliament buildings, now the Bank of Ireland. Dominating the lower quays, the magnificent Custom House, and on the upper quays, the majestic forecourts. Dublin is very much a Viking city. The Vikings first arrived to the north of Dublin on Lambay Island in 795 AD. Half a century later, 65 Viking longboats sailed up the River Liffey. The boats were made of oak, and the design was such that the shallow waters of the Liffey enabled them to sail in waters just 1 metre deep. Evidence suggests that the Vikings landed near the site of the present Father Matthew Bridge at the confluence of the two rivers, the Liffey and the Poddle. The Vikings consolidated their position and named their new settlement Difflin. Eventually, the Norsemen became farmers and settled down to a more peaceful existence, while always retaining the ability to strike terror in their enemies. By the 10th century, Difflin, the town of the Hurdle Ford, became the capital of the Norse settlement in Ireland. During the 1970s, extensive excavations at Wood Quay revealed the largest Viking site outside Scandinavia. Despite public protests, a controversial civic office block was eventually built over the site.
We stayed out of the controversy of whether the buildings were needed or not. That was not our business. Our business was to record to the maximum the archaeological evidence that was in the ground. I suppose it was. It was a pity they couldn't have built those civic offices somewhere else, but then the site had to be built over. There was no way the site could have been preserved in situ. So a development should have taken place there. Whether that one is the right one or not, I'm not sure. It's not a very attractive building to me.
By 1014, a Viking army was defeated a short distance away at the Battle of Clontarf by the Irish king Brian Boru. However, Norse kings ruled Dublin for a further 150 years. Eventually, a powerful new force arrived. This was to have a major influence on Dublin. The Normans had landed a large, well-equipped army on the east coast of Ireland. In the spring of 1171, this Norman knight was appointed to Dublin by King Henry II. His name, Richard Clare, Strongbow. where the Normans settled, a castle was established. It consisted of a wooden structure situated on top of a large earthen mound. Evidence of these mounds can still be seen today, like this one near Malahide in North County Dublin. When the Normans would arrive, they'd throw up a great mound of clay, and on top of that earthwork they'd put their little wooden castle. Then they'd dig a big ditch right around it and fill it with water. The ditch could be perhaps 3 or 4 meters deep and 10 meters wide. And outside the ditch and moat, the Normans would fence off a big area, and this was known as a bailey. Now, a bailey could be round or it could be square. As it happens, this is a square bailey. And inside the bailey, the Normans would build barracks for their soldiers, outhouses, and stabling for their horses. The Normans had now consolidated their position at Dublin. Within a few months, Strongbow's army was threatened by a 1,000-strong force which arrived in a fleet of ships from Norway. The Norsemen were no match for Strongbow's army, and they were defeated. The Normans were here to stay. With the approval of Henry II, Richard Clare, Strongbow, and the Archbishop of Dublin, Lawrence O'Toole, joined in a plan to build a cathedral on this site, the site of the present Christ Church Cathedral. And so the old Norse structure was to be replaced, and in its place would grow up one of the great Norman cathedrals, Christ Church Cathedral, here in Dublin. In the grounds of Christ Church Cathedral are the remains of an old Augustinian priory. On the south transept of the church is this fine 12th century Romanesque doorway, said to be one of the finest examples of its kind in Ireland. Within the walls of this great cathedral, the visitor cannot fail to be struck by its beauty and graceful proportions. The north wall, dating from the 13th century, is a true example of Gothic architecture, and during the 1560s, heavy rains disturbed the peat soil on which the cathedral stands. The roof and the south wall collapsed, causing the north wall to lean forward by up to half a metre, and after lying in ruins for over 300 years, the south wall was rebuilt thanks to the generous donations of a Dublin distiller, Henry Rowe.
Here in the helmet of Strongbow there is a hole, which people say was caused by a blow in battle and he died from it. The reason for that strange thing is that the merchant princes of Dublin in the Middle Ages came here to seal the bargain. In other words, if I was a leather merchant and I wanted to sell my goods to a glover or to a shoemaker, I would put the coin, whatever the price was, there on the hands of the Strongbow. And then when we both agreed, I would pick up the coin and I would literally strike the bargain by reason of hitting the helmet of Strongbow. And over the years, this wearing away has been caused by the citizens of Dublin striking with their coin the bargain.
Beside Strongbow's tomb lies a smaller effigy, said to be that of his son. And the story goes that Strongbow and the son were out riding when they were ambushed by some enemies. The boy panicked during the melee and rode away on his horse, and this so enraged Strongbow that he got his powerful sword and stuck it in the boy's belly, leaving him for dead. In the choir is this medieval lectern where the Holy Scriptures were read in English for the first time in Ireland. Nearby is the Chapel of St. Laud, where the reputed heart of St. Lawrence O'Toole is said to be encased in this metal casket. This crypt dates from 1172. That makes it not only one of the oldest structures in Dublin, but it's one of the largest medieval crypts in these islands. And this maze of stonework arches around me here bear the whole weight of the cathedral, including the great central bell tower. In 1487, a 10-year-old boy was brought from England to Christ Church. It was claimed that he was related to the deceased King Edward IV. The boy's name was Lambert Simnel, and he was crowned King of England here in Christ Church with the title of Edward VI. But his tenure was short. A month later, he was stripped of his title by Henry VII and was eventually employed as a scullery boy in the king's own kitchen. One of the oddities you'll come across in the cathedral are the mummified bodies of a cat and a rat. And they were discovered in an organ pipe sometime in the 1860s when the organ was being refurbished. Apparently what happened was this. The rat ran into the organ pipe, followed by the cat. And as the pipe reduced in width, first of all the rat got caught, and then the cat got caught. Their mummified bodies have been here ever since, poor old things. Christ Church was regarded as the state church or principal chapel royal of Ireland from its earliest days. It's now the cathedral of the Diocese of Dublin and Metropolitan Cathedral of the Southern Province. A short distance from Christ Church is the National Cathedral of the Church of Ireland, St Patrick's Cathedral. Dating from 1191, the church was raised to cathedral status in 1213. The present cathedral was built on the site of a holy well, and this ancient stone slab, unearthed here in 1901, was found near the holy well on which the church stands. And it's said that St Patrick baptised people here when he came through Dublin in the 5th century. During the 14th century, 2 fires ravaged the great building. During the 16th century, Henry VIII had the contents transferred to the crown. And in the 17th century, Oliver Cromwell used the cathedral, it is said, as a stable for his horses. The cathedral suffered much from neglect and abuse over the centuries. In the 19th century, extensive restorations were undertaken and financed by Sir Benjamin Lee Guinness, commemorated here at the southwestern door. There's an interesting yarn about this door with the hole cut in it behind me. The story goes that in 1492, the 2 great Irish families, the Fitzgeralds of Kildare and the Butlers of Ormond, were in great conflict. But the heads of the 2 families were persuaded to come in here into St Patrick's Cathedral to try and resolve their differences. But during the negotiations, the treacherous Geraldines discharged some arrows at the Butlers. The chief of the Butlers, Sir Thomas Ormond, ran into the chapter house and slammed this door shut. But one of the Geraldines was able to persuade him that a deal was imminent. He hacked a great hole through the door, and the 2 men put their arms through it and clasped hands, and a deal was done. Ever since, it's been known as the Door of Reconciliation. St Patrick's Cathedral has served as a prison, as a fortress, as a court of law, even as a college. But it was between the years of 1713 and 1745 that fame came to it through this man, the Dean of St Patrick's, the great Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift attended to the interests of St Patrick's for over 32 years until his death in 1745. He's buried next to his beloved Stella. A simple brass plaque marks his final resting place. Early medieval Dublin covered an area of 1.5 square kilometres and was surrounded by thick walls and fortified by towers. During the 13th century, increasing attacks on the city from Irish tribesmen prompted King John to provide a defensive structure. 'He ordered the building of a strong castle. 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 ' Walls 2 metres in thickness and up to 6 metres in height were erected. Dublin Castle became the seat of English administration in Ireland. The present St Audian's Arch is one of the last surviving city gates of the period. Nearby is St Audian's Church, dedicated to a 7th century Norman bishop. It contains some 15th century stained glass, and in the tower are Ireland's oldest church bells, dating from 1423. A visit to this area reminds one of the ancient settlements that once flourished during medieval times. During the Middle Ages, Dublin changed very little. However, the Black Death devastated the city and killed more than 14,000 people. In 1509, when Henry VIII was crowned King of England, he appointed Geroid Fitzgerald as his viceroy in Ireland. Some years later, Fitzgerald appointed his eldest son, Silken Thomas, to the position of viceroy. Geroid Fitzgerald was subsequently summoned to London, and Silken Thomas, believing his father to have been executed, went to the Council of State, threw his sword on the table, and declared open rebellion. Eventually, Silken Thomas was taken to London, and along with his uncles, he was beheaded. The most powerful Anglo-Irish family of the period was almost wiped out. In 1539, Henry VIII appointed himself head of the Church of England. On the subsequent dissolution of the monasteries and churches, all religious wealth was transferred to the Crown. Dublin was no exception. Precious church records and religious relics were burned and destroyed. In 1649, a new army landed at Ringsend in Dublin. Churches and monasteries were desecrated and burnt. The man responsible was Oliver Cromwell. Dublin was reduced to ruins, and the population dwindled to a mere 9,000 people. The extension of the city continued in the years which followed, largely due to one man, the Duke of Ormond. This royal hospital was built between 1680 and 1685. And 5 years later, William of Orange, having defeated James II at the Battle of the Boyne, had his wounded soldiers cared for here. When James retreated in haste to Malahide Castle near Dublin, he complained to the lady of the castle, "These Irish rascals left me and ran," to which she replied, "It seems then that your Majesty has won the race." Shortly afterwards, penal laws were enacted against Catholics, depriving them of all rights. The Protestant ascendancy now felt secure. These penal laws would last for almost 140 years. Trinity College, one of the most notable landmarks in the city, was now thriving. Within the college is this building known as the Rubrics, and said to be the only portion dating from this period. Erected between 1712 and 1732, to this day the old library receives a copy of every book published in Great Britain and Ireland. One of the great treasures here is the world-famous Book of Kells, an illuminated manuscript depicting the four Gospels. The book, regarded as the most beautiful of its kind in the world, was begun around 795 AD in Iona in Scotland. Despite ongoing Viking raids and the ravages of time over 10 centuries, this extraordinary book has survived. A new page of its elaborate and beautiful contents is displayed regularly. Passing through the great gateway arch is the Parliament or College Square. Famous distinguished Irishmen educated here included Robert Emmet, Wolfe Tone, the Dean of St. Patrick's, Jonathan Swift, and that man of great importance, Oscar Wilde. The 18th century saw Dublin become one of the most elegant and beautiful cities in Europe. During this time, Dublin's most magnificent buildings were erected. Parliament buildings in College Green, the Custom House, the forecourts, and dating from 1759, this little gem, William Chambers' Merino Casino. This period of architectural importance is also evident in the design of some of the finest residential areas within the city. The great Georgian Squares of Fitzwilliam and Merrion were built in this period. These noble squares were the setting for hundreds of private houses. The stylish entrance doors with elaborate fanlights over them were uniform in their very design, and yet no two are quite the same. The wrought iron railings of the period adorn the many balconies here. During the construction of Merrion Square, one observer wrote, "Most of the houses on the north side of the square are of granite right up to the first floor, and this gives them an air of magnificence inferior to nothing else of their kind in the world." The houses were occupied by well-known members of society, including poets, artists, writers and political leaders. Daniel O'Connell, the Liberator, who won political rights for Irish Catholics, lived at 58 Merrion Square South. Number 1 Merrion Square is the former home of Oscar Wilde. Nearby is the fine sculptured stone figure of Wilde, one of Dublin's most prolific writers. An outstanding building on the north side of Merrion Square is the National Gallery. Founded in 1854, it was built with subscriptions in memory of William Dargan, the well-known railway entrepreneur. His statue decorates the front lawn. This statue of George Bernard Shaw is by Trubetsky. Now, Shaw left 1/3 of his whole estate to the National Gallery in Dublin, and he once wrote that his education owed more to his days spent here in the gallery than it did in going to school. The confidence of the Georgian era is reflected in the many fine buildings of the period. Perhaps the most magnificent building in Dublin is the Custom House. Designed by the eminent architect James Gandon in 1781, the Custom House took 10 years to complete at the enormous cost then of £400,000. The majestic river frontage spans more than 125 metres. The dome, which rises to a height of 40 metres, is crowned by the Statue of Commerce. Underneath are the figures of Hibernia and Britannia, holding in their hands the emblems of peace, with the statue of Neptune driving away famine and despair. In one of the many enthusiastic comments written about the Custom House, the writer and traveller Charles Bowden wrote in 1791, "I have visited all the principal cities of Europe, and the new Custom House lately built here infinitely exceeds anything of the kind I have ever seen. And the Custom House remains a splendid existing example of 18th century architecture here in Dublin." During the construction, the building was regularly vandalised by local mobs who objected to its presence. On one occasion, a drunken mob threatened to fill the foundation trenches with water. They partly succeeded and ended up swimming in them. Although Gandon employed a large number of Dublin masons, he also employed a workforce from Britain, of which he wrote, "They were very orderly at first, but in the end more troublesome than the natives, more exorbitant in their wage demands, and more disorderly by way of drunkenness." It's believed that James Gandon's design for the Customs House was inspired by William Chambers' casino at Marino, which you see here behind me, and indeed that may very well be true, because Gandon was a student of Chambers who designed this magnificent building in 1745, and today, fully restored, it's one of the finest neoclassical buildings in the whole of Europe. In 1729, work commenced on Parliament buildings, now the Bank of Ireland. The East Wing was designed by Gandon in 1785 and became the Irish House of Lords. That great Irish parliamentarian Henry Grattan campaigned tirelessly for the political rights of Irish Catholics. He succeeded in establishing an Irish Parliament which was short-lived. In 1797, Grattan resigned from the Irish Parliament. The United Irishmen, a more radical movement, were determined to win rights for Irish Catholics, introduce reforms, and win independence from Britain. The political unrest culminated in the Rebellion of 1798, when many of their leaders were arrested, including the tragic figure of Lord Edward Fitzgerald. The Irish Parliament was finally abolished in 1800, and the Act of Union was passed the following year, making Ireland part of the United Kingdom. Gandon's new building was now redundant. Two romantic leaders emerged in the fight for independence, Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet. Tone was captured on the west coast, having landed from a French ship. To avoid being hanged, he committed suicide in prison. Robert Emmet's plan to attack Dublin Castle failed. He was captured, convicted of treason, and publicly executed on a scaffold in front of St. Catherine's Church in Thomas Street. An era of political stability ensued. Georgian Dublin continued to expand. Gandon completed his new masterpiece, the Forecourts. Situated on the lower quays, the Forecourts has a frontage of 145 metres, and this majestic building is dominated by the dome, which rises to a height of 30 metres. The front portico is supported by 6 Corinthian columns surmounted by the statues of Moses with justice and mercy on either side. The whole complex of buildings is interconnected with graceful arches duplicated on both sides of the front portico. Halfway between two handsome stone bridges, its setting on the River Liffey greatly adds to its attraction. During its construction, Gandon was criticised by some opponents. Reluctantly, Parliament advanced money, and the Forecourts was eventually completed at a cost of over £200,000. One caustic observer wrote of the contemptible vanity of the lawyers having the grandest building in Europe or in the world to plead in and walk around in. 20 years after the completion of the Forecourts, James Gandon died, and he's buried in this quiet churchyard in Drumcondra near Dublin. That same year, 1823, saw the great Irish liberator Daniel O'Connell organise the Catholic Association, which played an important part in the passage of the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, which effectively brought the penal laws to an end. O'Connell's statue dominates the main thoroughfare of the city, which is named after him.
1845 to 1849 were the years of the great potato famine in Ireland. Thousands of people fled the countryside and made for the cities where they might get food and certainly a passage to England. The government set up feeding stations and soup kitchens throughout the land. But in spite of that, the population of Ireland fell from more than 8 million in those years to less than 6.
After the famine, Dublin began to expand. The first Catholic university was founded in 1854. By 1872, horse-drawn trams were first sighted on the streets of Dublin. About this time, the Protestant nationalist Charles Stewart Parnell was leading the fight for Home Rule. In 1878, Parnell became an active opponent to the Irish land laws. 2 years later, he was elected to Westminster. During this time, Parnell encouraged the boycotting of payments to landowners and landlords. For this, he was imprisoned in Kilmainham jail. And during his short tenure there, he negotiated an agreement with Prime Minister Gladstone to call off the land war. The agreement became known as the Kilmainham Treaty. Parnell was released. Prime Minister Gladstone appointed Lord Frederick Cavendish to Dublin to oversee the change in the land laws.
Shortly after his arrival in Dublin, Cavendish and his chief secretary were brutally murdered here in the Phoenix Park by an extremist militant group known as the Invincibles. And this wooden cross set here in the ground marks the spot where Cavendish and the secretary, Thomas Burke, were found on that fateful day in May 1882.
The nearby River Liffey was searched for the discarded daggers used in the murders. Parnell, shocked by these killings, denounced them unequivocally. He continued to argue for Home Rule. Prime Minister Gladstone eventually conceded and introduced the first Home Rule Bill in April 1886. The bill was defeated. Despite the defeat of this bill, Parnell maintained his enormous popularity until his affair with Kitty O'Shea. She divorced her husband, William O'Shea MP, and married Parnell. A year later, at the age of 46, Charles Stewart Parnell was dead. After Parnell's death in 1891, the Home Rule issue faded. The people had lost their leader. Slums developed within the city. Dublin deteriorated. In Dublin in the early 1900s, Arthur Griffith, remaining loyal to Parnell's aspirations, founded the Sinn Féin party. By 1913, the working class population began to protest against low pay and poor working conditions. The Labour leader Jim Larkin addressed thousands of workers in Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street. The city had never seen anything like the violence that now erupted. There were police baton charges, bystanders were attacked, workers' homes were raided, culminating in loss of life. This led to the setting up of a military wing to protect Union members in November 1913, and out of that grew the Irish Citizen Army. 8 months later, an event would take place in a North County Dublin fishing village which would alter the course of Irish history forever. The patriot Erskine Childers and his crew navigated a 28-ton sailing vessel, Asgard, into Howth Harbour. A jubilant crowd awaited its arrival. Childers and Mary Spring Rice supervised the unloading of guns which had been purchased in Germany from the vessel. A group known as the Volunteers prepared to cycle to Dublin City to act as a decoy. En route to Dublin, they were confronted by British troops. While negotiations were taking place with the cyclists, the armed members at the rear were dispersed into small groups, still carrying their guns. Word soon spread to the city that the authorities had captured only a small portion of the guns. A contingent of the King's Own Scottish borderers opened fire on a protesting crowd. Several people were killed and scores were injured. Meanwhile, the Asgard and her crew were well out to sea, unaware of events now unfolding on the mainland. 2 months later, in September 1914, following the outbreak of World War I, the newly enacted Home Rule Bill was suspended. This suspension was the final straw. The Irish Citizen Army, armed with the Howth rifles and led by James Connolly, assembled outside Liberty Hall. At the same time, thousands of Irishmen were persuaded by John Redmond, the leader of the Home Rule Party, to join the British Army and fight for the freedom of small nations. James Connolly's Workers' Republic newspaper responded, "Full steam ahead," John Redmond said, "and everything was well, chum. Home Rule will come." On the morning of Monday, the 24th of April 1916, the Irish Citizen Army met at Liberty Hall in Dublin, where the proclamation of an Irish Republic was signed by Tom Clarke, Pádraig Pearse, Tomás MacDonagh, James Connolly, Eamon Kent, Sean McDermott and James Mary Plunkett. After signing, Pádraig Pearse ordered his volunteers to take up positions at strategic centres around the city, including the General Post Office in Sackville Street. And here Pearse read aloud the proclamation of the Republic. The Irish flag was raised for the first time, and Dublin Castle was attacked. The following day, Tuesday the 25th of April 1916, British troops entered Dublin and occupied the Shelbourne Hotel overlooking St. Stephen's Green. Irish freedom fighters, who included the Countess Markievicz, retreated from the Green to the nearby College of Surgeons. Initially taken by surprise, the British government dispatched General W.M. Lowe to assume command. British reinforcements arrived in Dublin and martial law was declared. Wednesday, 26th of April, General Lowe set up headquarters in Trinity College, a short distance from Sackville Street. The GPO was now under siege and heavily bombarded by British artillery. During a lull in the fighting, these passers-by watch as the British consolidate their position. Boland's Mills, where De Valera and his comrades were still holding out, came under heavy fire. British forces succeeded in isolating the GPO from the other insurgent positions. The GPO was pounded with artillery, leaving the interior completely gutted. Friday, 28th of April. Commanding officer of the British forces, General Sir John Maxwell, arrived in Dublin. By now, many buildings in the Sackville Street area had been destroyed. Fierce fighting took place and the British suffered serious casualties. A short while later, Pearse and his volunteers were forced to leave the burning GPO. Pearse surrendered to Brigadier General Lowe, and many of Pearse's men were dead. Others were exhausted. James Connolly, who had been wounded earlier, was carried out on a stretcher. The Countess Markievicz, who was second in command, was one of the last to surrender to British troops. Her unit held out in the College of Surgeons in Stephen's Green. Later, she would be the first woman to be elected to the English Parliament.
14 leaders of the 1916 Rising were imprisoned here in Kilmainham Jail and were executed. Eamon de Valera was the only commandant to be spared. And James Connolly, who had been wounded in the GPO, was carried on a stretcher through these doors, tied to a chair and shot by firing squad.
Joseph Mary Plunkett was perhaps the most romantic figure of the Rising. A member of the IRB, he had travelled extensively in Europe and returned to Dublin in poor health. On hearing of Pearse's occupation of the GPO, he left his hospital bed to fight alongside his comrades. He had proposed to Grace Gifford in this letter dated December 1915. This letter, the night before his execution, reads, "I beg to inform you your husband is a prisoner in the above prison and wishes to see you tonight. I am sending a car to bring you here. Your obedient servant, the Governor."
Later that evening, Joseph Mary Plunkett was led from his cell to the small prison chapel where Grace was waiting. A short ceremony was performed by the prison chaplain, and the couple were allowed to spend less than an hour together. The following morning, Plunkett was taken out and shot.
Later, as a member of Cumann na mBan, Grace herself was interned here. Inside her cell is a preserved mural of the Madonna and Child. By the spring of 1917, the executed leaders of the Rising were regarded as heroes. In the general election of 1918, Sinn Féin candidates won 73 seats. They refused to take up these seats and set up an independent Irish Parliament, Dáil Éireann. The first Dáil met at the Mansion House in 1919. Eamon de Valera was elected president. British resistance to an independent Irish Parliament led to the War of Independence between 1919 and 1921. The IRA, inspired by the leadership of Michael Collins, developed new guerrilla tactics in a war against the might of the British Empire. The ferocity of the struggle led to a new auxiliary force being dispatched to Ireland. From the colour of their uniforms, this notorious force became known as the Black and Tans. They were undisciplined and apparently above the law and engaged in indiscriminate acts of terror against the civilian population. Martial law applied for most of this period with a curfew imposed. In 1920, Michael Collins targeted a group of British agents operating in Dublin known as the Cairo Gang and shot them dead. That same day, Bloody Sunday, in retaliation for the shooting of these agents, the Black and Tans entered Croke Park and opened fire, killing 12 innocent people. In May 1921, the British administration in Ireland suffered its most serious setback. The IRA set fire to the Custom House, destroying vital government records. Gandon's masterpiece was gutted and British administration crippled. In this engagement, the IRA suffered significant losses. The conflict ended in July 1921 when Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, and the Irish Assembly member Eamon de Valera agreed to a truce. Between October and December 1921, de Valera appointed a team to negotiate a treaty with Britain. Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins led the Irish negotiating party, and this culminated in the signing of a treaty setting up an Irish Free State. The treaty was approved by 64 votes to 57. In June 1922, after a bitterly fought general election, the public endorsed the pro-treaty position. Eamon de Valera opposed the treaty, and he and his colleagues withdrew from the Dáil. Anti-treaty forces seized the forecourt and other buildings in Dublin. Collins failed to negotiate a peace pact with de Valera and his supporters. Commander-in-Chief of the Free State Army, he ordered the shelling of the forecourts. Once again, the streets of Dublin resembled a bloody battlefield where Irishmen fought Irishmen. In his book, The Irish Civil War, Tim Pat Coogan writes, "The Irish Civil War was one of the most superfluous and wasteful conflicts since the war between the Big Enders and the Little Enders that Jonathan Swift wrote about in Gulliver's Travels, which was fought over which end of the egg should be topped at breakfast." In the battle for the forecourts, the building was burned and priceless historical documents were destroyed. The fall of the forecourts signalled the defeat of the anti-treaty forces in Dublin. On the 22nd of August 1922, Michael Collins was shot dead in an ambush in his native County Cork. After Collins's death, the government appointed William T. Cosgrave as president. Cosgrave took a tough line against the anti-treaty forces who continued their campaign. In May 1923, de Valera finally convinced anti-treaty forces to cease fighting. De Valera was imprisoned for a year and was the last political prisoner to serve in Kilmainham jail. During the 1920s and 30s, the restoration of the city was undertaken. The Custom House was restored to its former glory, as was the forecourts. Under the newly independent Irish government, the reconstruction of the GPO began in 1925 and the building was reopened in 1929. A significant part of Dublin's culture is to be found in its rich pub life. Familiar haunts to such literary giants as James Joyce, Brendan Behan and Sean O'Casey. There are also some pubs with many historic associations.
This pub is reputed to be the oldest one in the whole of Ireland. The present structure dates from 1666, but it's built on the foundations of a much older building. And many a famous Irishman has had a drink here, ranging from Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet, the United Irishman, Daniel O'Connell, and that great Irish parliamentarian, Henry Grattan.
Dublin remains a cosmopolitan city, a city that still retains its medieval charm and its Georgian splendour.
This unicorn film is released without restriction as part of our Doing Good initiative. If you enjoy the film, please consider a donation to our designated registered charity for this film, which can be found in the video description below. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this Unicorn Films video. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed our content. Thank you.